Late one night in May 2023, a taxi driver in Busan, South Korea, grew suspicious of his passenger, a quiet young woman with a heavy, blood-stained suitcase. Alarmed, he alerted the police. The next day, authorities discovered a horrifying scene. Inside the abandoned suitcase were human body parts, the grisly evidence of a murder. They quickly traced the crime back to Jeong Yoo-jung, a 23-year-old who had been in the taxi. What they uncovered about Jung and her motive stunned the nation and the world. Jung was an avid consumer of true crime stories and shows, someone who had seemingly allowed a morbid fascination to cross the ultimate line. She later confessed that she killed a stranger simply to see what it felt like.
실종 사건으로 위장하려고 했습니다.
제정신이 아니었던 것 같습니다. 죄송합니다.
This case would soon be known as the murder out of curiosity, a phrase that sent chills down the spines of millions. To understand how we got here, we have to dive into Jeong Yoo-jung's life. Jung's upbringing was troubled. She was effectively abandoned by her parents at an early age and raised by her elderly grandfather. Described as a loner, she struggled to find direction in life. After finishing high school in 2018, Jung had no employment or university placement to anchor her future. In fact, she attempted to get into college multiple times and failed each time, a pattern of rejection and disappointment that left her isolated and frustrated. Living a reclusive life at home, Jung found escape in a peculiar hobby, consuming true crime content obsessively. She spent endless hours watching crime documentaries and reading novels about serial killers and murderers. Over time, this morbid curiosity started to consume her. Jung wasn't just interested in these stories, she was engrossed. Police later noted that she checked out countless books on crime from the library and scoured the internet for information on how murders are committed and how bodies can be hidden. It was as if she was studying for an exam, only the subject was murder. As Jung's obsession deepened, a dark idea took root in her mind. What if she tried it for real? Many people enjoy true crime as harmless entertainment or a way to understand evil, but Jung was different. By early 2023, she'd allegedly begun to fantasize about committing the perfect crime. Investigators would later find that she methodically researched how to kill without getting caught, from methods of murder to techniques for disposing of a corpse. In her secluded bedroom, Jung meticulously plotted a way to turn the gruesome stories she loved into reality. This was no impulsive act. It was premeditated to a disturbing degree. Jung's plan for murder needed one crucial element: a victim. She wasn't interested in killing someone she knew or had a grudge against. In fact, it would be a complete stranger, an innocent person, chosen at random. To avoid drawing suspicion, she sought a target who would willingly let her get close. That's when Jung turned to a popular tutor matching app, a service where private tutors and students, or their parents, connect for lessons. In this seemingly benign educational app, Jung saw the perfect hunting ground. Posing as the mother of a 9th grade girl, she messaged tutor after tutor, claiming she needed an English teacher for her daughter. Her profile appeared like that of a concerned parent seeking help for her child, nothing that would raise alarm. Jung's deception was elaborate. She even purchased a high school uniform to disguise herself as a student when the time came. For months, Jung trolled the app, approaching at least 54 different tutors with the same story. Most were women, perhaps intentionally. She targeted female tutors, whom she might perceive as more trusting or physically vulnerable. Many tutors didn't bite or insisted on meeting in public, but Jung persisted relentlessly. She was searching for the perfect opportunity, a tutor who would agree to hold lessons in their own home where she could catch them alone. It was a bold and chilling strategy, effectively inviting herself into a stranger's home under false pretenses. But this wasn't Jung's only plan. As later investigations revealed, she had tested other ways to find a victim, even before the tutor plot came together. Just one day prior to the ultimate crime, on May 25, 2023, Jung arranged to meet another young woman for a walk along the Nakdong River, perhaps intending to kill her by the isolated riverbank. That plan fell through when the walking path turned out to be too crowded with passers-by for an attack. On another occasion, Jung tried to lure a teenage boy to the same area via online chat, but the boy became suspicious of her odd behavior and refused to meet. These failed attempts showed just how determined and disturbingly creative Jung was in her quest to commit murder. She was actively hunting for the right victim and scenario, adapting her methods when one approach didn't work. Finally, Jung's persistence on the tutoring app paid off. In late May 2023, one of the tutors tutors she contacted agreed to a lesson at her home, taking Jung's bait. The tutor was a 26-year-old woman, a university student who did freelance tutoring on the side. For her privacy and out of respect, the victim's name was never released to the public. She's known only as a young woman trying to earn a living by helping others learn. This tutor had no personal connection to Jung. She was a complete stranger, chosen only because she said yes to a home lesson. It's haunting to imagine. Out of dozens of people Jung approached, this particular tutor was simply unlucky enough to fit into the killer's plan. Before the lesson, Jung put the final pieces of her disguise in place. She had the school uniform she bought online, and on May 26, 2023, she dressed herself in that outfit, transforming into the appearance of an ordinary high school student. Jung was physically petite, short enough that in uniform, she truly looked like a teenager. Satisfied that she could pass as the fictional 9th grade daughter, Jung headed to the tutor's residence in Busan. She carried with her a carefully prepared murder kit, which likely included a weapon. Authorities later noted the attack was premeditated, though they haven't publicly specified the exact knife or tool she used. What we do know is that Jung had every intention that day of carrying out the bloody deed she had been obsessing over for months. It was a warm afternoon on May 26, 2023, when the tutor opened her door to greet her new student. She saw a young girl in a school uniform, timid and soft-spoken, standing there alone. Perhaps the tutor found it a bit odd that the girl's mother wasn't with her, but she likely assumed the mother was busy and had sent the girl on her own. The disguise worked. The tutor believed Jung was just a school kid and welcomed her inside for the lesson. It would be the last mistake this kind-hearted educator ever made. Inside the tutor's home, a quiet, cozy space that should have been safe, Jeong Yoo-jung's dark plan sprang into action. At some moment during the session, Jung produced the weapon she had brought and launched a frenzied attack. She stabbed the unsuspecting tutor again and again, a frenzy of violence that defies comprehension. Later forensic analysis revealed that Jung stabbed her victim over 110 times. The brutality is staggering. Over 100 knife wounds inflicted on a woman who had simply opened her home to help a student. Jung's rage and determination in that moment must have been immense. According to reports, she even continued stabbing after the victim had already died. It was overkill in the most literal sense. One can only imagine the horror and confusion the victim must have felt in her final moments. A home that moments ago was filled with the routine atmosphere of a study session had turned into a bloodbath. Yet for Jung, this was the twisted culmination of her curiosity. She had done it. She had killed an innocent person, just as she had envisioned. But her gruesome work was not finished. Now she faced a practical problem that she had long prepared for: how to get rid of the body. The scene in the tutor's home was nightmarish. Blood soaked into the floor and furniture, and a lifeless body lay there. Jung, however, did not panic. In a display of eerie calm and calculation, she moved to the next phase of her plan. First, she left the crime scene temporarily, stepping out to retrieve supplies for disposing of the corpse. CCTV cameras later showed Jung casually leaving the victim's apartment, only to return shortly after. During this interlude, Jung went back to her own house nearby to grab a large black rolling suitcase she had ready. She also stopped by a local store, likely a convenience shop or supermarket, where she purchased garbage bags and bleach. These ordinary items were about to serve a horrifying purpose. Returning to the tutor's residence with cleaning supplies and the suitcase, Jung set about the grisliest task of all: dismembering the body. She laid out garbage bags and, with chilling composure, cut apart the victim's corpse to make it easier to hide. She even severed off the victim's fingers to impede identification via fingerprints. It's a detail that underscores just how cold-blooded and premeditated her actions were. Jung had learned from her true crime research that a body with intact fingerprints could be quickly identified, so she literally tried to scrape away the victim's identity. She wasn't entirely successful in that regard, but she did take further steps. Jung gathered the victim's mobile phone, ID card, and wallet and kept them. By removing the victim's personal items and identification, Jung hoped to delay the discovery of who the victim was. In her mind, if no ID was found with the remains, the police might think the victim simply vanished. All of this was part of Jung's fantasy of committing a perfect crime, a murder with no traces leading back to her. After the gruesome dismemberment, Jung packed many of the body parts into the suitcase she had brought. The rest of the remains she sealed in bags. Some of those she decided to leave at her own home, perhaps planning to dispose of them later in multiple trips. Before zipping up the suitcase, she likely cleaned up as best she could, wiping down surfaces, using bleach to destroy evidence of blood. But blood has a way of getting everywhere in a crime scene that violent. There's only so much one person can do in a short time. Still, Young was moving with conviction and chilling steadiness, not terror. A forensic psychology professor, Lee Soo-young, later remarked that Young's lack of panic was extremely unusual. Even many seasoned criminals feel some terror or hesitation after a first kill, but Young was as composed as if this were just a routine chore. In a final act of deception, before she left the tutor's apartment, Young peeled off her bloody school uniform and changed into the victim's clothes. Think about that. She literally dressed herself in the clothes of the woman she had just brutally murdered. This served two purposes. One, her school uniform was likely stained with blood. She needed clean clothing to exit the scene without drawing attention. Two, if anyone saw her from a distance, they might actually mistake her for the victim. After all, now she was an adult woman walking out, not a schoolgirl. In some twisted way, Young was assuming the victim's outward identity, if only for a short time. In fact, some experts speculate that Young envied the victim's life to the point of wanting to inhabit it. The tutor had a prestigious education and promising future, everything Young felt she lacked. Young keeping the victim's ID card could even suggest she had fantasized about taking over her identity entirely. This theory of envy adds another disturbing layer to the crime. It wasn't just curiosity, it might have been jealousy and yearning to become someone else. With the suitcase now packed and her appearance altered, Young left the crime scene. It was likely night by then. She hauled the heavy suitcase, now filled with the weight of her terrible secret, out of the apartment and onto the street. Security camera footage later revealed a small framed figure, Young, dragging a black rolling suitcase away from the victim's home under cover of darkness. Neighbors didn't notice anything unusual at the time. A young woman leaving with luggage could mean anything, perhaps a late-night trip. No one could imagine the true contents of that bag. Outside, Young hailed a taxi. When the cab pulled up, she loaded the bulky suitcase into the trunk. The driver took note of her destination request, an area near the banks of the Nakdong River on the outskirts of the city. It was a fairly long drive from the urban neighborhood, and notably, a secluded, wooded area by the water. During the ride, the taxi driver later recalled that his passenger seemed quiet and unremarkable, except for one thing. The suitcase had a strange, metallic smell, and there were smears or stains that looked like blood on it. One can imagine the driver's growing unease as he drove through the night, perhaps glancing in the rearview mirror at the young woman who sat calmly after, unbeknownst to him, committing unspeakable violence. Young had shown extraordinary composure up to this point. She likely felt confident that she had covered all her bases. She had cleaned the scene, disguised herself, taken identifying items, and now was moments away from disposing of the body. Her plan for the perfect crime was on track, or so she thought. The taxi reached a remote riverside forest area in Yongsan, along the Nakdong River, under the cloak of darkness. Young stepped out, thanked the driver, and wheeled the suitcase out to a hidden spot among the trees. There, she abandoned the suitcase full of body parts, leaving it to the elements. The remainder of the victim's remains, those she hadn't packed, were still back at Young's own house, but she probably intended to dispose of those soon as well. Satisfied that she had distanced herself from the corpse, Young allowed the taxi driver to take her back, or perhaps she went on foot from there. We do know that she made her way home after dumping the evidence, likely believing she had just gotten away with murder. However, fate and basic human vigilance intervened. The taxi driver could not shake his suspicions about that odd young passenger with the ugly, stained suitcase. Something in his gut told him something was very wrong. After dropping Young off, the driver made the courageous decision to report his encounter to the police, describing the woman and the location where he had driven her. This quick-thinking Good Samaritan would prove to be Young's undoing. The so-called perfect crime was about to unravel in less than 24 hours. When Busan police received the taxi driver's tip, they wasted no time. Officers were dispatched to the remote area by the Nakdong River, where Jung had dumped the suitcase. There, in the woods, they found the abandoned suitcase, and the horrifying contents confirmed their worst fears. Inside were human remains, sliced and packaged grotesquely. It didn't take long for investigators to link this discovery to a missing persons report that was likely filed when the 26-year-old tutor hadn't been heard from. Perhaps her family or friends became concerned quickly, or the connection was made through the tutoring app records. By the next day, May 27, 2023, police had identified Jeong Yoo-jung as the prime suspect and arrested her at her home. The arrest itself yielded even more damning evidence. A search of Jung's residence uncovered blood-stained clothes and body parts that she had kept from the victim. Investigators likely found the victim's severed remains that Jung hadn't managed to dispose of yet, as well as the victim's phone, ID, and wallet hidden among Jung's possessions. possessions. In other words, when confronted by police, Jung was literally caught red-handed with the blood of her victim and pieces of the crime in her own home. It was an open and shut case, at least in terms of evidence. Jeong Yoo-jung had meticulously planned a murder, but her downfall was equally swift and sure. When taken into custody, Jung at first showed no visible remorse, according to police reports. In fact, her behavior was oddly detached, given the gravity of what had happened. However, faced with police interrogation, Jung did not immediately confess. Instead, she spun a bizarre series of lies in an attempt to evade responsibility. Initially, Jung claimed that she hadn't killed anyone at all. She told officers that she had stumbled upon the tutor already murdered by some other unknown person, and that she only took the body and dismembered it out of fear or confusion. This story was absurd on its face. Why would an innocent bystander decide to cut up a body and haul it away in a suitcase if they found a murder scene? The police certainly didn't buy it. Confronted with facts she couldn't explain away, like being caught on camera at the victim's home or being in possession of the victim's remains, Jung changed her story again. Next, she claimed that, yes, she was present at the tutor's home, but that things had escalated accidentally. She insisted that she killed the tutor in self-defense during an argument. This, too, rang false. The ferocity of the attack, over 100 stab wounds, was not exactly consistent with an act of self-defense, and Jung's careful preparations, disguise, weapon, cleanup supplies, clearly showed premeditation rather than a sudden fight. As Jung cycled through these excuses, investigators kept pressing. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Police likely showed her the CCTV footage, the taxi driver's testimony, the search history on her computer, and so on. Interestingly, Jung's own family cooperated with law enforcement and urged her to come clean. Perhaps her grandfather or other relatives, upon learning what she was accused of, pleaded with her not to make things worse with lies. Under mounting pressure and unable to maintain her false stories, Jeong Yoo-jung finally confessed to the truth. She admitted that she alone had planned and executed the murder of the tutor, a woman she had never met before that day. In a chilling admission, Jung reiterated that she did it simply because she was curious about killing. The case was solved. The killer was in custody, and she had confessed. But the shockwaves of this crime were only just beginning to ripple through society. On June 2, 2023, a few days after her arrest, Jung was paraded in front of the press as police transferred her from the station to the prosecutor's custody. A common practice in South Korea for high-profile cases, cameras flashed as this slight young woman, now a notorious murder suspect, stood with her head low, face covered by a bucket hat and mask. In front of reporters, Jung spoke briefly to address the public outrage. "I apologize to the victim and her family. I must have been out of my mind," she mumbled in a quiet voice.
실종 사건으로 위장하려고 했습니까?
제정신이 아니었던 것 같습니다. 죄송합니다.
It was a moment of purported contrition, though many doubted her sincerity. Was she truly remorseful, or just sorry she got caught? Either way, her statement did little to quell the public's anger and horror at her actions. With Jeong Yoo-jung's confession in hand and a mountain of evidence, prosecutors moved quickly to ensure she faced justice. Her first court appearance, the start of her trial, took place on July 14, 2023. By this time, the case had become a media sensation in South Korea. The idea of a young woman committing such a gruesome act out of curiosity was the subject of countless newspaper headlines, TV debates, and social media discussions. People struggled to understand how or why someone would do such a thing. Under the glare of this public scrutiny, Young's trial commenced. In court, prosecutors laid out a portrait of Young's motive that went deeper than her own simple explanation. They argued that Young's crime was rooted in long-standing feelings of resentment and anger, a toxic blend of emotions stemming from her troubled life. Here was a woman who had faced abandonment by her parents, isolation, repeated academic and employment failures, and who watched others her age succeed where she could not. According to the prosecution's narrative, Young's obsession with true crime was not just entertainment, but also an escape and a twisted coping mechanism for her helplessness and rage at her own situation. The murder, then, was seen as an expression of that pent-up anger. She chose a successful young woman, the tutor was in university and doing well, as the target, perhaps out of envy and resentment. Young might have subconsciously wanted to destroy someone who embodied everything she felt she should have been. This theory aligned with Professor Lee Soo-jung's earlier analysis analysis that Young possibly wanted to have what the tutor had, hinting at deep envy. For her part, Young's defense tried a very different tactic. They claimed that she was mentally disturbed and not fully responsible for her actions. When given a chance to speak, Young pleaded for a lenient sentence, alleging that she suffered from hallucinations and other mental health issues that drove her to kill. Essentially, her lawyers were suggesting that she was not in her right mind, despite her own previous remark about curiosity, and that perhaps she should be treated rather than punished harshly. It's not unusual in such heinous cases for defense teams to explore the insanity or diminished capacity route. However, in Young's case, this claim faced an uphill battle. Police had already stated that Young had no record of any diagnosed mental illness or prior psychiatric treatment. Moreover, the methodical planning and calculated cover-up efforts seemed starkly at odds with the idea of someone in a hallucinating daze. The prosecution countered her insanity claims with hard evidence of clear-headed preparation. Internet search records showed that in the months leading up to the murder, Young had researched methods of killing and body disposal extensively. That's not something an accidental psychotic break would explain. They also presented a telling piece of evidence, a phone call recording from just days before the murder in which Young had threatened to kill her own father during an argument. This demonstrated her violent ideation and ill intent even before she ever met the victim, undercutting the notion that a sudden hallucination was to blame. Additionally, the prosecution highlighted those earlier attempts to lure other victims. Young's pattern of behavior suggested a deliberate, patient hunter, not someone in a temporary frenzy of madness. Throughout the trial, Young remained relatively quiet and emotionless, much as she had during the investigation. It was reported that she scored extremely high on psychopathy assessments, indicating a callous, unemotional personality with a propensity for manipulation. Psychopathy isn't a formal mental illness that would absolve one of legal responsibility. Rather, it's a description of a person who lacks empathy and remorse. If anything, that label painted Young as more of a continuing danger, not less. The court also heard from psychological experts who testified that simply being a true crime aficionado does not turn a person into a murderer. There are millions of true crime fans who never commit any violence. What set Young apart were those additional predispositions and personality traits, her possible psychopathy, her life circumstances, and her choices. In other words, there was no simple explanation like a TV show made her do it. Jeong Yoo-jung was a complex product of her environment and her own dark inclinations. After several months of proceedings, the verdict was delivered on November 24, 2023. The Busan District Court found Jeong Yoo-jung guilty of murder, as well as desecration and abandonment of a corpse, charges that were never in doubt, given her confession and the evidence. The real question was the sentence. Prosecutors, reflecting public outrage, had pushed for the death penalty. In South Korea, the death penalty is still technically legal, but it has not been carried out since 1997 and is generally reserved for the most egregious cases. Many wondered, would this young woman, who killed with no motive other than curiosity, be among those rare cases deemed exceptional enough for execution? In the end, the judges decided against death. Jeong Yoo-jung was sentenced to life in prison. The chief judge, Kim Tae-ob, made a pointed statement that Jeong had no mental illness that could explain her act, dismissing her claims of hallucinations. He emphasized that her crime was a carefully planned and executed atrocity, not an impulsive or uncontrollable episode. The court described her actions as deliberate, premeditated, and cruel. While acknowledging the brutality of the crime, the judges also noted factors like Jeong's age, 23, and the broader context, which likely influenced their decision to opt for life imprisonment over execution. South Korean courts historically have been hesitant to impose death sentences, especially if the defendant is young and could potentially be rehabilitated, however slim that chance might be. Jeong's reaction to receiving a life sentence was not extensively reported, but we know that her defense had asked for mercy and that her apologies in court were ultimately deemed insincere or insufficient to warrant any leniency. The judges were unmoved by her courtroom pleas. They ordered that in addition to life in prison, Jeong must wear an electronic location tracking device for 30 years in the event she is ever released. In South Korea, a life sentence can include the possibility of parole after a certain time. In Jeong's case, she will be eligible for parole after 20 years behind bars. This means, at least on paper, Jeong could walk free in her 40s if she's deemed reformed by that time. Though given the severity of her crime, society's tolerance for her release would likely be extremely low. The story did not quite end there. Both the prosecution and Jeong's defense filed appeals after the sentencing. Prosecutors were dissatisfied with what they saw as a too lenient punishment innocent and continued to demand a death sentence. Jung's lawyers, on the other hand, appealed for a reduced sentence, still clinging to the argument of her alleged mental instability or other mitigating factors. The case moved up to the appellate level at the Busan High Court. In March 2024, the High Court reviewed the circumstances. They concluded that the death penalty should be reserved for only the most exceptional cases and did not apply it to Jung. Essentially, they upheld the life sentence, rejecting the prosecution's push for execution. Unsatisfied, prosecutors made one final appeal to the nation's highest court. In May 2024, the Supreme Court of South Korea took up Jung's case. This was effectively the last chance to change the outcome. After deliberation, on June 13, 2024, the Supreme Court confirmed Jeong Yoo-jung's life sentence as final. The top court agreed that life in prison was appropriate given all the circumstantial factors, the offender's age, behavior, background, and motive, and it did not see sufficient cause to impose the irreversible punishment of death. With that, Jung exhausted all her legal avenues. She would spend the foreseeable future, likely the rest of her days, in a prison cell at the Busan Detention Center, left alone with a very dark curiosity that led her there. When news of Jeong Yoo-jung's crime first broke, and then later, as details came out through the trial, the public reaction was intense. South Korea, like many countries, has its share of violent crimes, but this case struck a nerve for several reasons. First, the sheer randomness of the murder was deeply unsettling. Anyone can become a victim for no reason, people realized with horror. The tutor had done nothing to put herself in harm's way, beyond being kind enough to open her home to a stranger. There was no feud, no debt, no love triangle or revenge plot. All the typical motives one hears about were absent. This was a murder that could have happened to absolutely anyone who happened to cross paths with Chung at the wrong time. That notion spread a wave of fear throughout society. Many began looking at friendly strangers with suspicion, an unfortunate development in a country known for low crime and communal trust. Second, the demographics of the case were unusual and disquieting. The perpetrator was a young woman. Violent crime, particularly of this savage nature, is statistically far more often committed by men. Jeong Yoo-jung didn't fit the common profile, which made the story even more shocking. A quote circulated from a forensic psychology expert, marveling that most murderers would be terrified after killing. But Chung displayed no such fear or panic. Her calm, calculated actions, like returning home to get a suitcase, shopping for bleach mid-crime, and coolly dismembering a body, left even seasoned experts stunned. It was as if they were dealing with a character from a thriller novel rather than a real person. This led to Chung being labeled in the media as a psychopathic killer, a moniker that, based on police evaluations, seemed fitting. The public, already gripped by the gruesome details, also found themselves grappling with a kind of morbid curiosity about Chung's psyche. How could someone, especially someone who doesn't look like a monster, do such monstrous things? The case also ignited a debate about the influence of media, specifically true crime content, on real-life violence. Here was a self-professed true crime fanatic who turned fiction into fact. It was an easy narrative for some. Did the podcasts, TV shows, and novels make her do it? This question was discussed on talk shows and online forums extensively. However, many experts pushed back against the idea that true crime entertainment was to blame. Behavioral scientists pointed out that there are countless ardent fans of true crime stories who would never dream of harming another person. The consensus among professionals was that Chung's obsession with crime media may have fed her fantasies, but it didn't create them. Underneath her consumption of macabre stories were likely much deeper issues. Her personality traits, like a lack of empathy, her life disappointments, and perhaps untreated psychological problems. In short, her case was the result of a complex mix of factors, and it's too simplistic to point at her Netflix queue or bookshelf as the sole culprit. As one expert noted, society tends to look for addictive, one-size-fits-all explanations for horrors like this, but reality is rarely that simple. Jeong Yoo-jung was not a normal true crime fan. She was an outlier who let her darkest curiosities take control. In the aftermath, practical concerns also came to the forefront, especially regarding the tutor-student matching app that Chung exploited. When people learned that the killer found her victim via a popular tutoring app, it sent chills through the many communities that rely on such services. Parents and students began questioning how safe it really was to meet strangers for lessons. Likewise, tutors, many of them college students or young graduates earning side income, were alarmed that they could have been in that victim's place. Reports soon emerged that scores of college-age tutors were rushing to delete their accounts from tutoring platforms, unwilling to take the risk after hearing what happened in Busan. The very tool designed designed to connect and educate had been turned into a weapon by Chung, and it shattered trust in a way that may take a long time to repair. Some users called for stricter identity verification and safety measures on such apps. For example, requiring in-person ID checks or background verifications for anyone signing up as a student or parent. Others suggested that first meetings for lessons should always happen in public places or via video call until trust is established. The companies behind these tutoring apps pledged to review their safety protocols, but they also emphasized that this was an unprecedented, unforeseeable act by a malicious individual. Regardless, the sense of security was deeply shaken. What was once normal, inviting a tutor or going to a student's home, now felt dangerous to many. The media coverage of the Jeong Yoo-jung case was extensive not just in South Korea, but internationally. Major outlets like the BBC and CNN ran stories on the case, often highlighting the chilling simplicity of Jung's motive. A young woman murdered a stranger out of curiosity is a headline that inevitably grabs attention and horrifies. The story went viral, sparking discussions about everything from the state of mental health support for youth to the impact of isolation and unemployment on young adults to the timeless question of nature versus nurture in creating a killer. In Busan, where the crime took place, there was an outpouring of grief for the victim, a promising life cut short so cruelly, and an outpouring of anger at the perpetrator. Some called for Jung to face the death penalty, arguing that someone who could do what she did didn't deserve to live. Others, while not sympathizing with Jung, pondered what could have been done to prevent such a tragedy. Could anyone have noticed the red flags in time? It's difficult to say, since Jung lived such a reclusive life and hid her dark intent until the moment she acted. Even now, with Jeong Yoo-jung locked away, the echoes of her crime linger. True crime podcasts and YouTube channels, much like this one, dissect her case, trying to glean lessons or warnings. Psychologists reference her when talking about female killers or the influence of violent media. And ordinary people, especially those who use tutoring apps or invite service providers into their homes, carry a bit of extra caution in the back of their minds. The case forces an uncomfortable reflection. How well do we really know the people we trust in our daily lives? The friendly tutor, the quiet client, the stranger on a rideshare app. 99.999% of the time, these encounters are perfectly safe, but Jung was that one-in-a-million aberration who reminds us that evil can wear the most unassuming face. In the end, Jeong Yoo-jung will spend likely the rest of her life behind bars, where she cannot harm anyone else. She will have decades to reflect on the monstrosity of what she's done, if she's even capable of true reflection or remorse. Perhaps, for someone like Jung, the reality of prison life will eventually pierce the bubble of fantasy she'd built around crime. Perhaps not. As for the rest of us, we are left with the story, a cautionary tale of how dark curiosity, unchecked and combined with personal demons, can lead to unthinkable horror. This case is as chilling as they come. A murderer with no motive but curiosity, a victim who is simply trying to do a good deed, and a society left reeling in the aftermath. It's the kind of story that haunts your thoughts long after you hear it. Jeong Yoo-jung set out to experience what it's like to kill. Now, for the rest of her days, she gets to experience what it's like to be a murderer caught and punished, a fate she willingly brought upon herself. And an innocent young woman, whose name we unfortunately may never know, became the tragic sacrifice to one person's dark fascination. In Jung's own words, she claimed she was out of her mind. Insane or not, she will never escape the consequences of that deadly curiosity.